Welcome to the Growing in Grace podcast, where you can listen in on some casual conversation about the good news of Jesus without all of the inconsistent religious double talk. If you've ever struggled with feelings of hopelessness, guilt, and despair, or wondered if you're really right with God, it's time to discover the true freedom that comes with the gospel of unlimited and overflowing grace.
Growing in Grace, the podcast at growingingrace.org. Thanks for coming along and listening to us share our thoughts on the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm Joel Brizicki, along with Mike Kapler, talking some faith and works. And hopefully this is something that will be beneficial to anyone listening. We are talking about somewhat of a controversial subject, and I understand if people have some problems with anything that we're saying, but that's okay. I mean, the thing here about this Growing in Grace podcast is that we are two guys who, got to know each other 25 plus years ago, 26 years ago, I guess we met, and we found, well, Cap, you started sharing some gospel truths with me, and it really resonated with me. And eventually, we began doing what has become this podcast. And we're just two guys who are sharing our thoughts on what we see regarding the gospel, regarding faith and works, regarding God and what He has done, and what we don't need to do in regard to works and things like that. And so we hope that this is something that will help you in your own walk with God, to see that He is everything to us, and that our responsibility is to simply believe Him, and that we don't have to have any works added to our faith. That's the gospel. And if we have to add any works to it, then we can boast before God, but we're not able to do that. So we're simply sharing what we believe, what we see here.
Yeah, the subject here is justification that we were talking about last week. I mean, in a nutshell, between James and Paul. And Paul saw it, again, this is our view. This is, it's our podcast. We're explaining how we see this. And it has evolved over the years, by the way.
Yeah.
But on the subject of justification, Paul talked about faith apart from works. James said something quite the opposite. You're justified by works and not by faith alone. He said that. He said that as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works or without works is dead. That's not what Paul said.
Right.
Here's the thing. Most of us have been taught there are just no contradictions in the Bible, because that would seem to diminish what we claim to be the truth contained within those pages regarding the person of Jesus Christ. And so we get in that mindset. And so when we see something that looks like a contradiction, we kind of have to try to reconcile that somehow. And that's what most of us have done over the years. We try and, we look at what Paul said, we look at what James said, and then we say, well, they really are on the same page. They're just saying some things a little differently here. And that was me for many years. And I'm sure Joel can say the same thing. And so we have to try to figure out a way to reconcile what appear to be contradictions. These were human beings who didn't always see everything the same way. And that doesn't take away from the truth of who Jesus is. I've talked before briefly, we need to be careful about becoming Bible worshipers, all right, instead of Jesus worshipers. Jesus isn't a book, all right? And the Word has been around long, since even before there was a beginning. He has always existed. He was manifested. He became flesh, and He died in our place. The Bible hasn't always existed. I know we refer to the Bible a lot of times as the Word of God. Jesus is the true Word, and these pages contain many truths through revelations that help us in our faith when it comes to believing in Jesus Christ. Now, believing in Jesus, as I mentioned toward the end of last week's program, we got to be careful about getting on the wrong trajectory when it comes to a foundational issue such as justification. Because if we get this wrong, what else are we going to get wrong as we thumb through the chapters and the verses? A lot of us have a hard time agreeing on a lot of different things when it comes to theology, but we should all be able to rally and agree upon Jesus and how one is justified and made righteous. And we believe, as what we see in the writings of Paul, who is taught this by revelation through Jesus, we believe that it is by faith apart from works when it comes to justification. I'm not saying that works aren't important, but we're on the subject of justification here. So, Joel, I say all that to say that if you are under the impression that you need to try and reconcile what appear to be contradictions all of the time, then you're going to probably run into some sort of inconsistencies in what you're communicating with people. That's why we see all of these things that Paul wrote through all of those letters in the New Testament about justification by faith, righteousness as a gift. All of that's in there. And yet we still get the question, well, what about what James said in that one verse? That one verse, tripping people up, when we can stop and maybe just consider that they just didn't agree entirely on the subject of justification. Is it a big deal? Yes, it is. But that doesn't take away from who Jesus is.
Exactly. Jesus is the point. And how is a person justified really? That is the point. To some people, it may shake their faith a little if we're suggesting that two people who wrote epistles in the Bible contradicted each other or didn't agree with each other. To me, that doesn't shake my faith. And I think what I said last time is that James wrote and taught what he believed at the time that he wrote and taught and believed it. And Paul wrote and taught what he believed when he wrote and taught and believed it. And that's okay, because in the early church, there were a lot of misunderstandings about what the gospel was and about what it took for a person to be justified. Like you say, the subject here is justification, and how is a person justified? We don't have to take away from the scriptures or say, Martin Luther didn't think that the book of James should even be in the Bible. If you hold to the view that we're holding, you can run with that if you want to. Martin Luther may very well have been right. Or another view is that you can just see that, okay, James and Paul didn't see eye to eye, and we see simply right here, point blank, they both write exactly what they believe, and to us it doesn't appear that they agree, and we can say that that's okay. That's what happened in the early church, and ever since then, like you say, there have been disagreements all throughout time. And so one interpretation that I've heard from other grace teachers, and this is fine too if you want to go with this, is that James was actually talking about the response of belief as the work. I've heard other teachers teach this, that, James was really just saying, using the examples of Rahab, the harlot, and also the example of Abraham, just to show, okay, so they had a work to show for their faith, but that points to us of the need to respond to faith, that we need to believe in Jesus. Even the demons believe, but we need to actually respond with actually believing Jesus, not just believing that he exists. And that's kind of what I would try to do. I used to try to do that, try to make James be saying that. But really, when you look at what he says, something that you had pointed out, Cap, was that Paul, when he used the example of Abraham, he pointed to Genesis 15:6. Abraham believed God, and he counted it to him as righteousness. And that's it. He believed God. No works had been done at that time. That was how Abraham was justified. But James, he brings up that he says in verse 21 of James 2, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with works, and by works his faith was made perfect? Paul never says anything about that. He makes it clear that when a man does not work, he says it clearly, to him who does not work. That's how a person is justified. No works involved. There's clearly a disagreement here. I mean, even if James is making another point, I liked the word that you used either earlier today or last time, that his summary, how James summarized what he was saying was that you see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only. No matter what he said at the beginning, throughout chapter 2, he summed it up by saying, you see that a man is justified by works and not by faith only. And for as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead. And what I have said all along for many years is that really the proof of faith isn't works. Because some people will say, well, the works are just show that we're justified. Well, actually, the proof of faith is a person who is at rest in the fact that there are no works that they can do to be justified. That's how I see things, and I think that's how Paul saw things too. Like you said, works are not a bad thing. We're not against works, but the subject is how is a person justified, and I think Paul is clear that it's not by works, and I think James says something a little bit opposite of that.
Yeah, it's becoming more obvious to me, but again, people are afraid. They're kind of driven by fear to try to reconcile Paul's view and James' view because they're afraid that the seemingly contradicting things that they're saying between each other, we somehow have to harmonize those teachings. We don't want that disunity there between those letters of Paul and James because people fear that would cause the entire Bible to become untrustworthy. That's not the case at all.
No.
And a lot of times they'll come up with these man-made illustrations, like Paul was teaching fire and James was teaching smoke, where there's fire, there's smoke, where there's smoke, there's fire. And you try and come up with all these different things instead of the way that we're looking at it. One thing I would mention, though, about this justification by faith or works, it doesn't matter if you're on a deathbed 50 minutes before you die, or whether you've been saved for 50 years, you are justified by faith through the blood of Jesus Christ. That is the scenario. If you were on a deathbed and you experience salvation, the life of Jesus Christ, shortly before you leave this planet, without performing any works after that, do you still go to heaven? Of course you do. And the same is true for the person who has been walking with Jesus for 50 years. It doesn't change from person to person. It works the same way for everybody. And again, as I mentioned in past programs, don't confuse forgiveness with salvation. They're not the same thing. Salvation is the restoration of God's life in us, which was lost in Adam, because the wages of sin, the sinful nature, was death that we inherited through Adam. So, yeah, we're going to be talking a lot more about this, too, in the weeks to come, and there's a whole lot of things to get into.
Oh, yeah, definitely. There's much more to talk about with all of this. I mean, we could just do a podcast or two and leave it. But, with 700, 800 podcasts here, why not do a little series here? If a person really wants to get into this, we'll have several podcasts on this. If not, you can go back and listen to some other ones we've done. But yeah, there's plenty more, like Peter being opposed by Paul. Paul opposed Peter to his face, all because of these men from James and how they caused Peter to act. And what if Paul and James disagree? So what do we do with that? We'll talk about some things like that. Paul and James and their different uses of Abraham, talking about Abraham. So much more to come in the weeks to come right here on Growing in Grace.
This has been Growing in Grace with Mike Kapler and Joel Brieseke, heard online through various internet sources around the world each week. Access past programs by visiting growingingrace.org. Share it with a friend and listen again next week for more Growing in Grace.